You ever watch someone realize too late that they became the villain? The voice trembled through a teenager's phone speaker as the video recording shook violently above the crowd. Summer heat rolled across the downtown Atlanta Street Festival in thick waves, bouncing off food trucks, police barricades, and rows of white tents stretched beneath the glaring July sun. Children laughed near the inflatable slides. Music pulsed from giant speakers mounted beside the main stage. The smell of barbecue smoke and melted funnel cake sugar hung heavy in the humid air. Everything changed in less than 5 seconds. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the VIP entrance with mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes and one hand gripping a high-pressure water hose connected to the city sanitation line. His dark blue uniform looked sharp and spotless despite the 90-degree heat. Sweat darkened the collar near his neck, but his expression never softened. "I said move back," he shouted over the music as the stream of water exploded forward. The blast slammed into Naomi Carter hard enough to force her sideways against the metal barricade. Collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Her thin gray waitress uniform clung instantly to her skin, soaked from shoulder to ankle as cold water splashed across the pavement beneath her worn sneakers. The paper pharmacy bag in her hand burst apart like wet cardboard. Orange prescription bottles scattered across the flooded sidewalk, spinning through dirty water toward the storm drain. Several people lifted phones higher instead of helping. Someone laughed nervously. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Naomi dropped to her knees immediately, not to argue, not to scream, but to reach desperately for the bottles before the current pulled them away. Her fingers shook as she crawled through puddles forming around the curb. "Please," she said breathlessly, barely loud enough to rise above the music. "Please stop. My son needs those." But Brooks didn't lower the hose. "You crossed the barricade after multiple warnings," he barked coldly. "You people think rules don't apply to you." The words landed heavier than the water. Naomi froze for half a second. Around them, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A woman holding lemonade lowered her eyes. A man near the taco stand slowly stopped recording. Naomi's chest rose sharply as she reached again for one of the floating prescription bottles drifting inches from the sewer grate. "Please," she repeated, voice cracking now. "It's heart medication." Brooks glanced toward the VIP line behind him, where wealthy donors and local officials stood watching beneath shaded tents with catered drinks and misting fans. Jaw tightened. Control mattered to him more than compassion ever could. The radio clipped to his shoulder crackled with static while sunlight reflected off the silver badge pressed against his chest. Naomi finally caught one bottle with trembling fingers, clutching it against her soaked uniform like it was something sacred. Then another voice shattered the moment completely. "Mom!" The scream came from behind the barricade. Small, terrified. Every head turned at once. A little boy no older than 10 stood near the sidewalk, clutching his chest with both hands. His skinny shoulders shook violently beneath an oversized red t-shirt already damp with sweat. Elijah Carter's breathing sounded thin and uneven even from 30 feet away. His knees buckled suddenly against the hot pavement. The prescription bottle slipped from Naomi's hand. It rolled silently through the water while the color drained from Officer Brooks's face behind his sunglasses. For one terrifying second, the entire festival stopped breathing. The music still blasted from the speakers near the main stage, but it sounded far away now, muffled beneath the panic spreading across the street. Elijah Carter collapsed against the hot pavement beside the barricade, his small fingers clawing weakly at his chest as air fought to move through his lungs. Naomi lunged toward him instantly, splashing through dirty water without even noticing the soaked fabric clinging to her skin. "Baby, look at me," she whispered desperately as she dropped beside him. Her shaking hands cupped his face gently. "Come on, Elijah. Stay with Mommy." The crowd that had been recording only seconds earlier slowly lowered their phones. Teenage girl near the lemonade cart covered her mouth with both hands. Someone in the back muttered, "Call an ambulance." Naomi closed her eyes for half a heartbeat as fear tore through her chest. Not again. Please, not again. Around them, sunlight reflected sharply off puddles spread across the asphalt like shattered glass. Officer Brooks stood frozen near the barricade, the water hose still dangling loosely from one hand. The stream had weakened now, spraying harmlessly against the curb, but the damage had already been done. He stared at the little boy gasping on the pavement, and something unfamiliar crept slowly across his face. Not anger, not authority, fear, real fear. Naomi barely noticed him anymore. Her world had narrowed into one sound only, Elijah struggling to breathe. "Baby, listen to me," she whispered quickly, brushing wet curls away from his forehead. "Remember what Dr. Levin said. Slow breaths. Nice and slow." Elijah tried. His small chest trembled violently beneath the oversized red shirt. Sweat mixed with tears along his temples. Naomi glanced wildly toward the crowd. "Please," she cried out. "Does anybody have a phone? Somebody call 911. A man in a Braves cap finally snapped awake and reached for his cell phone. Another woman dropped beside Naomi, holding out a towel from one of the food stands nearby. Naomi thanked her without even looking up. Her voice sounded thin now, exhausted from fear and humiliation and heat all crashing together at once. Across the barricade, several city officials standing beneath the shaded VIP tent exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them quietly stepped backward as cameras continued recording everything. Officer Brooks slowly removed his sunglasses. The noise of the festival returned in fragments around him. Children crying, radios crackling, distant music pounding against the humid air. He looked down toward the storm drain near his boots and finally saw it. The prescription bottle had become trapped against the metal grate beneath inches of dirty water. The white pharmacy label stared back at him through the puddle. Cardiac emergency medication. Refill overdue. His stomach tightened instantly. Naomi saw the direction of his eyes and followed them. The moment she spotted the bottle lodged beside his feet, something inside her cracked open. Not rage. Something sadder. "I waited 3 hours at the pharmacy for that prescription," she whispered weakly, barely able to form the words. "My insurance barely covered it." Brooks swallowed hard. The badge pinned to his chest suddenly felt heavier than it had that morning. Elijah's tiny hand reached blindly for his mother's wrist, while his breathing became thinner still. And for the first time in many years, Officer Daniel Brooks no longer looked like the man in control of the street. He looked like a man realizing he had made a terrible mistake. The ambulance sirens had not arrived yet, but panic was already moving through the festival faster than sound. Naomi held Elijah tightly against her chest near the flooded curb, while his fragile breaths fluttered unevenly beneath the humid Georgia heat. The little boy's eyelashes trembled against his damp cheeks. His skin looked frighteningly pale, now beneath the flashing sunlight reflecting off the puddles around them. "Stay with me, baby," Naomi whispered over and over, rocking him gently despite her own hands shaking uncontrollably. "Mommy is right here." Nearby, people who had spent the last few minutes filming now stood in uncomfortable silence. Some stared at the ground. Others glanced nervously toward Officer Brooks, as if waiting for someone else to tell them how to feel. The festival music finally stopped completely, leaving only the distant hum of generators and the hiss of water still leaking slowly from the abandoned hose. Brooks could hear every breath the child struggled to take. He bent down stiffly near the storm drain and reached into the dirty water with both hands. Cold runoff soaked through his sleeves as his fingers searched beneath the grate until he finally grabbed the orange prescription bottle wedged against the metal bars. He pulled it free and stared at the label again. Elijah Carter. Congenital heart condition. Emergency dosage required. The words blurred slightly in the sunlight. Brooks swallowed hard as a memory surfaced without warning. A hospital hallway 12 years earlier. The sharp smell of disinfectant. His younger brother lying pale beneath white sheets after an asthma attack nobody had taken seriously fast enough. Brooks blinked hard, forcing the image away, but the feeling stayed. Naomi looked up as he slowly approached her holding the wet prescription bottle in trembling hands. For the first time since the confrontation began, his voice sounded smaller. "Human. I did not know," he said quietly. Naomi stared at him for a long moment, water dripping from her soaked hair onto the pavement beneath her knees. Her eyes looked exhausted more than angry. "You did not ask," she answered softly. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Brooks looked down immediately. Around them, cameras were still recording. A local reporter near the barricade lowered her microphone slightly, sensing something shifting in the air that no headline could fully explain. Elijah suddenly coughed weakly against Naomi's shoulder, his tiny body tightening with another painful struggle for air. Instinct took over before Brooks could think. He dropped to one knee beside them on the wet pavement. How long has he been like this? He asked urgently. Naomi hesitated only a second. Since birth, she whispered. Stress makes it worse. Heat too. Brooks unscrewed the prescription bottle with clumsy fingers while Naomi carefully helped Elijah sit upright. The little boy's breathing rattled softly between each pause. Brooks handed over the medication without speaking. Naomi quickly placed the emergency tablet beneath Elijah's tongue the way doctors had taught her years ago. All three of them waited. The city sounds around them blurred into distant noise again. A police radio crackled somewhere behind the barricade. A food truck generator hummed steadily beside the sidewalk. Water continued sliding slowly along the curb, carrying crushed ice, napkins, and melted lemonade through the afternoon heat. Brooks stayed kneeling beside them the entire time. He did not care anymore that people were watching. Sweat rolled slowly down the side of his face while guilt settled heavier in his chest with every passing second. Elijah's breathing remained uneven at first, but after nearly a minute, the little boy finally pulled in one deeper breath. Then another. Naomi closed her eyes instantly as relief broke quietly across her face. Her shoulders sagged beneath the soaked gray uniform like her body could finally remember how to breathe too. Brooks lowered his head without realizing he was doing it. The concrete beneath his knee felt rough and hot through his uniform pants. Somewhere behind him, a man in the crowd whispered softly, "He is crying." And when Brooks reached up toward his face, he realized the stranger was right. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later, but by then the street already felt different. The energy that had filled the summer festival earlier was gone, replaced by a strange quiet that drifted between the barricades like smoke after a storm. Naomi sat on the curb, holding Elijah close beneath a towel someone had brought from a nearby food stand. The little boy's breathing had steadied some, but his small body still trembled from exhaustion. Every few seconds, Naomi brushed damp curls away from his forehead with gentle fingers, as if touching him was the only thing keeping her grounded. Across the street, people whispered while pretending not to stare. Some still held their phones at chest level, uncertain whether to stop recording or keep documenting what had happened. Officer Brooks remained kneeling beside the curb even after the paramedics rushed in carrying medical bags and portable monitors. Water darkened the knees of his uniform pants. His badge reflected flashes of red and blue light from the ambulance parked crooked beside the festival entrance. One paramedic quickly checked Elijah's pulse while another attached a small oxygen tube beneath his nose. "He is stabilizing," the older medic said calmly after a moment. Naomi exhaled so suddenly it almost sounded painful. Tears gathered in her eyes again, but she blinked them away before they could fall. She had spent too many years teaching herself not to break down in public. One of the younger paramedics looked toward Brooks with visible tension. "What happened here?" he asked carefully. Brooks opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. The crowd nearby leaned in slightly, waiting. Heat shimmered above the pavement, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Finally, Brooks swallowed hard and answered quietly, "I made a mistake." The words hung in the humid air heavier than the sirens had. Naomi lowered her eyes toward Elijah instead of looking at him. She did not seem surprised by the confession. She only looked tired. Kind of tired that settles into a person after years of surviving things they should never have had to survive. Nearby, a local news camera slowly moved closer. Brooks noticed it immediately this time, but unlike before, he did not straighten his posture or hide behind authority. He looked directly at the lens for half a second before lowering his head again. A little girl standing beside her father near the barricade whispered softly, "Why is the policeman crying?" Her father did not answer. Brooks rubbed a shaking hand across his face and stared at the wet pavement beneath him. Water still trickled slowly toward the storm drain, carrying bits of confetti and paper cups through the afternoon heat. The same water he had sprayed only minutes earlier while believing he was protecting order. Now all he could see was a frightened mother crawling through puddles for medicine. Naomi suddenly shifted beside Elijah and winced quietly. One of the paramedics noticed immediately. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Naomi shook her head automatically even though her body looked exhausted. "I am fine," she whispered. But Brooks saw the way her hands trembled. He saw the soaked shoes falling apart at the seams. The faded diner logo stitched onto the sleeve of her gray uniform. The tiny holes near the cuff where fabric had worn thin over time. Details he would never have noticed before. Details he had trained himself not to see. A gust of warm wind swept through the festival, rattling plastic banners overhead. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began clapping softly. Then another person joined. Brooks looked up in confusion as the sound slowly spread through the street. Not loud or celebratory, but gentle. Respectful. Naomi seemed startled by it too. She tightened her arms around Elijah protectively, while people around them lowered their phones completely for the first time all afternoon. And standing there beneath flashing ambulance lights and dripping summer heat, Officer Daniel Brooks realized something that unsettled him more than public shame ever could. People watching were no longer afraid of him. They were watching to see whether he still deserved the uniform he wore. Rain began falling less than 20 minutes after the ambulance doors closed. At first, it was only a soft drizzle tapping against the flashing emergency lights, but soon warm summer rain spread across the entire festival street, washing away spilled soda, melted ice, and the chalk drawings children had made earlier that morning. Most of the crowd had already disappeared beneath parking garage awnings and storefront roofs, yet a strange heaviness still lingered in the air around the barricades. Naomi sat inside the back of the ambulance beside Elijah while a paramedic monitored his heart rate with quiet concentration. The little boy looked exhausted now, curled beneath a thin gray blanket with oxygen tubing resting gently beneath his nose. His breathing had become steadier, but every inhale still sounded fragile enough to make Naomi's chest tighten. She brushed her fingers slowly across his forehead while rainwater dripped from the ends of her damp hair onto the ambulance floor. Across the street, Officer Brooks stood alone beneath the downpour without moving. His uniform was soaked through completely now, dark fabric clinging heavily to his shoulders while water streamed from the brim of the cap, hanging forgotten in his hand. Several officers had arrived after the incident, but none of them seemed sure what to say to him. A younger cop approached carefully near the curb. "Internal Affairs is already asking questions," he muttered quietly. Brooks gave a small nod without looking up. "I figured." The younger officer hesitated. "The videos are everywhere already." Finally glanced toward the glowing cell phone screens still visible beneath nearby awnings. Strangers were replaying the footage over and over. The water hose. Naomi kneeling in the street. Elijah collapsing beside the barricade. Him dropping to his knees afterward like a man whose entire identity had cracked open in front of the city. Brooks looked away quickly. For years he had believed fear created respect. Now he understood how quickly authority could become humiliation when stripped of humanity. The ambulance doors suddenly opened behind him. Naomi stepped carefully onto the wet pavement, holding Elijah's small backpack against her chest. She had changed into a dry sweatshirt one of the paramedics gave her, but exhaustion still showed across her face like shadows beneath dim light. Brooks straightened instinctively when he saw her. Rain drummed softly against the ambulance roof between them. "He is stable," Naomi said quietly before he could speak. Brooks nodded once. Relief flickered briefly across his face before shame settled there again. Neither of them moved for a moment. Water slid along the curb beside their shoes while distant thunder rolled above the Atlanta skyline. Finally Brooks spoke, his voice rougher than before. "I spent 15 years wearing this badge." He looked down at the silver shield pinned to his chest. "And somehow I stopped seeing people." Naomi watched him silently. Her eyes carried the tired patience of someone who had heard apologies arrive too late many times before. Brooks swallowed hard. "When I saw you cross that barricade, I already decided who you were before you said a single word." Rainwater rolled down the side of his face like tears he no longer bothered hiding. "That little boy almost paid for my arrogance." Naomi lowered her eyes toward Elijah's backpack in her hands. One of the zippers had broken years ago and been repaired carefully with blue thread. "People do not always remember what they say," she answered softly, "but they remember how small you made them feel." Brooks closed his eyes briefly as the words settled deep into him. Across the street, the festival banners snapped sharply in the wind. Red and blue lights reflected against the wet asphalt like broken pieces of color drifting through the rain. Then, without warning, Brooks reached up slowly and unclipped his badge from his chest. The metal trembled slightly in his hand. He stared at it for a long moment before stepping forward beneath the rain and placing it carefully on the hood of the ambulance between them. Naomi looked at the badge, then back at him. Brooks lowered his head. "Maybe I do not deserve to wear it tonight," he whispered. The rain did not stop for nearly an hour. By the time the ambulance finally pulled away from the deserted festival street, water covered the sidewalks in shimmering sheets beneath the orange glow of streetlights coming alive one by one across downtown Atlanta. Naomi sat quietly beside Elijah inside the emergency vehicle while the city blurred past the fogged windows in streaks of red brake lights and neon reflections. Elijah had fallen asleep against her shoulder at last, exhausted from the terrifying afternoon. Tiny hands still clutched the sleeve of her sweatshirt tightly, even in sleep, like part of him feared waking up alone. Naomi rested her cheek lightly against the top of his head and stared out into the rain without speaking. Across town, Officer Brooks remained standing exactly where the ambulance had left him. The summer festival was over now. Workers folded soaked tents beneath the storm, while sanitation crews pushed puddles toward overflowing drains. Somewhere nearby, music equipment was being packed into trucks with dull metallic clanks echoing through the wet evening air. Barely noticed any of it. His badge still rested on the hood of the empty ambulance bay where he had left it. Rainwater collected around the silver edges, washing over the engraved letters beneath the flashing police lights. Protect and serve. The words looked different to him now. Smaller somehow. Fragile. A senior officer approached slowly beneath a black umbrella. Captain Raymond Ellis had spent nearly 30 years on the force, long enough to recognize when a man was carrying more than guilt in his silence. Beside Brooks and glanced down at the abandoned badge. "You planning to leave that there all night?" he asked quietly. Brooks did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the rain sliding across the pavement. "I looked at that woman today," he finally said, voice rough with exhaustion, "and all I saw was trouble." Captain remained silent for a long moment. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the umbrella between them. "Daniel," he said carefully, "good officers make mistakes." Brooks shook his head slowly. "No, good officers ask questions before they humiliate people." The words hung heavily in the cold evening air. Across the street, a television mounted inside a diner window replayed cell phone footage from earlier that afternoon. Brooks caught a glimpse of himself kneeling beside Naomi in the flooded street while headlines crawled beneath the screen. Festival incident sparks public outrage. Witnesses demand accountability. He looked away immediately. Shame pressed against his chest harder than the soaked uniform clinging to his skin. Meanwhile, inside Grady Memorial Hospital, Naomi sat alone beside Elijah's bed while machines hummed softly through the dim room. The lights had been lowered low enough that the rain outside reflected gently across the floor tiles like moving shadows. Elijah slept peacefully for the first time in hours, his breathing steady beneath the pale blue blanket pulled up to his chest. Naomi watched the monitor rise and fall with each heartbeat, while exhaustion settled deep into her bones. A nurse entered quietly, carrying dry clothes folded neatly in her arms. "Someone dropped these off for you downstairs," she whispered kindly. Naomi frowned slightly. "Who?" The nurse shook her head. He did not say. After she left, Naomi unfolded the small paper bag resting beside the clothes. Inside was a replacement prescription already paid for in full. Beneath it sat a handwritten note, smeared slightly from rainwater. "I forgot your humanity before I forgot my oath. I am sorry." Naomi stared at the uneven handwriting for several seconds while thunder rolled softly outside the hospital windows. Then she folded the note carefully instead of throwing it away. And somewhere across the rain-soaked city, Officer Daniel Brooks sat alone on the hood of his patrol car beneath flickering streetlights, staring at empty hands that no longer felt worthy of carrying authority. By sunrise the next morning, the video had spread far beyond Atlanta. Television screens inside barbershops, airport lounges, diners, and waiting rooms replayed the same moment over and over again. A police officer standing beneath the blazing summer sun. A soaked woman on her knees searching for heart medication in dirty floodwater. A little boy collapsing beside a barricade. Then the image that stayed with people most of all. Officer Daniel Brooks kneeling in the street with tears running down his face while the crowd watched in silence. Inside Grady Memorial Hospital, muted sunlight slipped through pale curtains beside Elijah's bed. Storm had finally passed overnight, leaving the city washed clean beneath a soft gray sky. Naomi sat curled in a plastic chair beside her son, still wearing the borrowed sweatshirt from the paramedics. She had barely slept. Every time Elijah shifted beneath the blankets, her eyes opened immediately. Years of fear had trained her body not to rest too deeply. Elijah stirred softly just after 7 o'clock and blinked awake. "Mom," he whispered. Naomi leaned forward instantly, relief warming her tired face. "Baby." Elijah glanced around the hospital room slowly before looking back at her. "Did I scare you?" Naomi smiled faintly despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "More than you know." The little boy lowered his gaze toward the blanket. "I am sorry." Naomi brushed her fingers gently across his forehead. "You never apologize for needing help." A quiet knock interrupted the moment. Naomi turned toward the door expecting another nurse, but instead froze slightly when she saw Officer Brooks standing there in plain clothes holding a small paper bag carefully against his chest. Without the uniform, he looked strangely older, more tired. The sharp authority he carried the day before had disappeared completely. For a second, nobody spoke. Hospital machines hummed softly through the silence while morning light reflected against the polished floor tiles. Brooks stopped near the doorway instead of walking fully inside. "I asked the nurse if it was okay," he said quietly. Naomi nodded once, but did not speak. Brooks looked toward Elijah first. "How are you feeling, buddy?" Elijah shrugged slightly. "Better." Brooks gave a small nod of relief. Then his eyes shifted back toward Naomi, uncertainty settling heavily across his face. "I know saying sorry does not erase what happened," he said carefully, "but I needed to say it anyway." Naomi studied him silently. She noticed the deep shadows beneath his eyes, the wrinkled shirt like he had slept in it, the way his hands kept tightening around the paper bag nervously. Brooks slowly stepped forward and placed the bag on the chair beside the hospital bed. "There is a new prescription inside," he explained softly, "and some groceries. Nothing fancy, just enough for a few days." Naomi looked at the bag but did not touch it immediately. Brooks lowered his eyes toward the floor. "I spent all night thinking about how quickly I judged you." His voice roughened slightly. "I looked at you and saw a threat before I saw a mother." The room fell quiet again except for Elijah's steady breathing. Finally, Naomi spoke, her voice calm but tired. "Do you know what hurts most?" Brooks looked up slowly. "It is not the water hose," she said. "It is knowing my son watched someone treat his mother like she was less than human." The words landed softly, but Brooks flinched harder than if she had shouted them. Elijah glanced between them quietly beneath the blankets. Brooks swallowed hard and nodded once. "You are right." He looked toward the window where sunlight now stretched across the hospital floor. "My father used to tell me the badge was supposed to protect dignity, not take it away." Naomi watched him carefully. "What happened to that man?" Brooks gave a faint, broken smile. "Yesterday he finally looked in the mirror." Elijah suddenly reached toward the paper bag beside the bed and pulled out a small toy police car resting near the groceries. Brooks blinked in surprise. "I thought you might like it," he said awkwardly. Elijah rolled the toy slowly across the blanket for a second before looking up at him. "Are you still a police officer?" Brooks hesitated. The question seemed to hit somewhere deep inside him. Then quietly, honestly, he answered, "I do not know yet." By late afternoon, the hospital room no longer felt as cold. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows in soft golden strips, warming the pale walls while the steady rhythm of Elijah's heart monitor filled the silence like a quiet promise. Naomi sat beside the bed, helping Elijah finish a cup of orange gelatin from the cafeteria tray. The little boy looked stronger now. Color had finally returned to his cheeks, and every small laugh from him loosened something tight inside her chest that had been there for years. Outside the room, nurses moved through the hallway with rolling carts and tired smiles while televisions mounted near the waiting area continued replaying footage from the festival. But something had changed in the coverage now. People were no longer only talking about humiliation. They were talking about what happened after. A police officer kneeling in the street beside a frightened child. A man breaking apart beneath the weight of his own actions. Naomi had noticed the shift immediately. So had Officer Brooks. Stood alone downstairs near the hospital vending machines, staring at his reflection in the dark glass of the snack dispenser. He had not worn the uniform again since yesterday. The badge still sat locked inside his glove compartment untouched. Reporters had already contacted the department demanding statements. Internal Affairs wanted interviews by morning. Friends from the force had texted him all day, some supportive, others distant. But none of it stayed in his mind as heavily as one memory. Naomi crawling through floodwater searching for medicine, while strangers recorded her pain like entertainment. Brooks rubbed both hands across his face slowly and exhaled hard. You look terrible, Captain Ellis said as he approached carrying 2 cups of stale coffee. Brooks accepted one quietly. Probably because I earned it. Ellis leaned against the wall beside him. You know most men would spend today defending themselves. Brooks stared into the coffee without drinking it. That is the problem. Stairs. Elijah suddenly looked toward the doorway while Naomi folded his blanket carefully near the edge of the bed. Mom, he whispered. Can Officer Brooks come back? Naomi paused slightly. Why? Elijah shrugged beneath the hospital gown. Because he looked sad. Naomi looked toward the hallway for a long moment without answering. The truth was she still did not know what to do with the strange ache sitting inside her chest. Part of her remembered every humiliating second beneath that water hose. Crowd staring. The fear in Elijah's breathing. But another part of her remembered Brooks kneeling in the rain afterward with tears on his face, no longer hiding behind authority. It would have been easier if he had stayed cruel. Easier to hate him completely. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Brooks stood at the doorway again, this time holding a small paper sack from a local bookstore. He hesitated before entering. I can leave if this is a bad time, he said quietly. Naomi looked at Elijah first. The little boy smiled faintly beneath the blankets. You came back. Brooks nodded once. I said I would. He walked slowly toward the bed and handed Elijah the paper bag. Inside rested a children's astronomy book with bright stars scattered across the cover. Elijah's eyes widened instantly. You remembered. Brooks gave the smallest smile. You said yesterday you wanted to be an astronaut someday. Elijah ran his fingers carefully across the book cover while Naomi watched silently from beside the bed. Brooks shifted awkwardly before finally looking toward her. Internal Affairs wants my statement tomorrow morning, he admitted. Naomi crossed her arms lightly. And Brooks swallowed. And I told them exactly what I did. The room fell quiet except for the distant hum of hospital air vents. No excuses, he continued softly. No edits. No blaming stress or procedure or crowds. He lowered his eyes briefly. Just the truth. Naomi studied him carefully, searching for arrogance, defensiveness, anything false. But all she saw was exhaustion and regret. Real regret. Brooks looked back at her slowly. I spent years believing strength meant controlling people, he said. Yesterday your son taught me it actually means protecting them. Naomi's expression softened almost invisibly. Then Elijah looked up from the astronomy book and asked the question neither adult expected. Are you still scared of us? Brooks looked at the little boy for a long moment before answering honestly. No, he whispered. I think I was scared of admitting how wrong I had become. 3 weeks later, the summer heat had softened into warm evening air drifting gently through downtown Atlanta. The city festival grounds looked almost unrecognizable now. The barricades were gone. The stained pavement had been cleaned. Children chased bubbles beneath glowing streetlights, while local musicians played soft jazz near the reopened food stands. Life had moved forward the way cities always do, quietly swallowing yesterday's outrage beneath tomorrow's noise. But some things had changed permanently. Naomi Carter walked slowly across the plaza holding Elijah's hand while the little boy pointed excitedly toward a telescope demonstration set up near the center fountain. His laughter carried lightly through the evening air, healthier now, fuller somehow. Naomi smiled as she watched him hurry ahead toward the astronomy booth with his book tucked proudly beneath one arm. The doctors had adjusted his medication after the incident, and for the first time in years, she had enough support to keep his prescriptions filled without choosing between medicine and groceries. She still worked long shifts at the diner, but strangers now recognized her sometimes. Not because she had become famous, because people had finally learned to see her. Nearby, a city council banner fluttered softly above the plaza entrance announcing new community reforms between local officers and residents. Public listening programs, medical emergency training, accountability reviews. Changes nobody would have discussed before that afternoon in the rain. Naomi paused near the fountain when she noticed a familiar figure standing quietly across the square. Daniel Brooks no longer wore a police uniform. Tonight he stood in simple dark jeans and a light button-down shirt with both hands folded awkwardly in front of him. He looked uncertain about approaching, like a man still learning how to exist without authority protecting him. Naomi noticed something else too. For the first time since she had met him, his shoulders looked lighter. Brooks slowly walked toward her beneath the warm glow of the overhead lights. Evening, he said softly. Naomi nodded once. Evening. For a second, neither spoke. Music drifted gently through the plaza while water shimmered across the fountain behind them. Brooks glanced toward Elijah laughing beside the telescope exhibit. He looked stronger. Naomi followed his gaze, pride warming her tired eyes. He is. Brooks smiled faintly before reaching into his jacket pocket. I wanted to give you something. He held out a small folded envelope, carefully protected against the evening breeze. Naomi accepted it slowly. Inside rested a photograph clipped from a local newspaper. It showed Elijah smiling from his hospital bed, holding the astronomy book Brooks had brought him. Beneath the picture was a headline that read, "Compassion changes more than policy." Naomi stared at the photograph silently while Brooks rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I resigned 2 days ago, he admitted quietly. Naomi looked up slowly. Brooks nodded once toward the plaza around them. I realized the badge stopped meaning service a long time ago for me. The fountain water reflected softly across his face as he spoke. So I decided if I ever wanted to help people again, I needed to start as a human being first. Naomi studied him carefully. There was no bitterness in his voice. No self-pity. Only honesty. Real honesty. Brooks glanced down toward the pavement before speaking again. Cannot undo what happened. Naomi folded the newspaper clipping carefully inside the envelope. No, she answered softly. But you stopped pretending it did not matter. The words settled gently between them. Across the plaza, Elijah suddenly waved excitedly toward Brooks from beside the telescope stand. Come look at Saturn, he shouted. Brooks blinked in surprise. Naomi looked toward her son, then back at Brooks standing uncertainly beneath the warm evening lights. Finally, she gave the smallest nod. Go ahead, she said quietly. Brooks walked slowly across the plaza toward Elijah while laughter